Welcome everyone to our latest webinar. I know there are still lots of people joining because we're right at the top of the hour, but I want to be respectful of people's time, so I don't want to leave us too late to get started. My name's Rebecca Fay. I'm the head of marketing at the newly merged, it's 6 months now actually, Natural Capital Partners and Climate Care. So delighted to welcome you to our webinar today, people from all over the globe. Thank you very much for joining us. We have a lot of people registered, which I think is an indication of the interest in the topic. I hope you enjoyed our pun on COP-licated, because I think there is an indication of a lot of talk about COP and what it means, but the need to perhaps get some understanding of what it really means for businesses and how to simplify it. Before I get really started, just a couple of housekeeping points. You will all be on mute, but we would very much like your questions. So please use the Q&A button down at the bottom to submit your questions, and please use that rather than the chat function, because that makes it easier for us to moderate them. I will be chatting to Jonathan and asking questions throughout, so please keep yours coming because we can feed them throughout. We don't have to hold the Q&A until the end. And to introduce Jonathan, I just want to say that from Copenhagen through to Paris, with many different locations in between, Jonathan has been our resident expert, attending COPs, tracking what's going on, and most importantly, interpreting what is happening at COPs and what that actually means for our clients and our partners. So I'm going to hand over to Jonathan to set the context for this COP. It's been eagerly anticipated. I think we probably have been surprised by the amount of attention COP is getting this year. Even my mum asked me about it, which I think is an interesting indication of how far and wide awareness of this COP has spread, which is a positive thing. But it's still confusing to many what's going on, what it really means, what's likely to mean. So I'm delighted to hand over Jonathan, who's going to try and help us, guide us through that. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca, and hello to everybody who's joined. Thanks for making the time. Rebecca, your comment about your mum, I have a barber down in the village here in the south of England, and he was asking me, about this COP26 thing. And you've talked about our punny title about COP-licated. And where I want to start off is actually trying to simplify a lot of complexity around the topic. So I'm going to take on the task or the challenge of trying to make COP-licated very simple. So my simple thesis for what I'm going to cover today in the next half an hour or so is that COP26, lots of noise, of course, millions of, literally sort of hundreds, thousands of commitments, pledges, people stepping up, lots and lots of pre-COP material about the gap in ambition, etc. But I do feel that particularly for our audience, which is made up of corporates, private sector, non-state actors, as I call them here, really taking action as a complement to the slow progress over that period that you highlighted, Rebecca, from Copenhagen all the way through Paris to today. So, there's no doubt, though, that COP26 is a crucial staging post on the pathway to an effective global response to the challenge. But, we really do all understand that we need deeper national commitments to achieve the 1.5 target. And if you've been reading any of the reports from UNEP and many others, you'll know that the IPCC's, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's interpretation of what we need to do, we're nowhere near that. And there was actually a report out this morning from PwC looking at some of the leading countries and finding out that their rates of decarbonization are way off what they should be. So what we need from COP is for those commitments to be defined. We need to be reassured that they're going to be actioned. They're going to be measured, reported, and assessed. Really good. So this is my third point. So even when we get them to add up, there's still another couple of steps to go, which could be, one or two more COPs before we get to the point where they are well-defined, definitely been actioned, definitely, measured and reported and assessed. But, one of the things we've got to recognize if we look at the next point is that the Paris Agreement is in and of itself something of a voluntary agreement amongst nations. It has no remedy for bad actors, countries that decide to pull out, as happened under the Kyoto Protocol. Or, in fact, if we define, action, measure, and report on these nationally determined contributions, what do we do if a country underperforms? There are no remedies for that. So going on to my next point, COP26 will probably confirm either explicitly or implicitly that voluntary action across the non-state sectors, and by that, for this audience, I really mean corporates, is key for success. The process, the UNFCCC process, is long, drawn out, fraught with negotiations and against a backdrop of a very fractious world. COVID has had its impact. We've got China and the US squaring up against each other. We've got India, Brazil, South Africa, defining, standing firm on the issues that they feel are important. Voluntary action, which actually has begun, and to my next point, is really coming of age as a valued complement to compliance under the UNFCCC. And that's my thesis for this 20-minute presentation, that actually voluntary action writ large is now ready to take the main stage. It will be no substitute, none whatsoever, for a fully implemented and effective Paris Agreement, but it's going to play a pretty useful role in complementing that. So Rebecca, if that set us up, then let's go to the next slide. And when we examine whether it's compliance or action under the Paris Agreement, or that being taken in anticipation of the Paris Agreement, we often hear these words bandied about. There's a lack of ambition, or there's no ambition amongst countries or even corporates, that there's a lack of quality around carbon credits for that matter, or the quality of an NDC of a developing country or even developed countries, that they lack quality because they lack definition. And then there's a third element in integrity, that often gets used. Well, we know that corporates are using quality carbon credits from the leading standards in the space, but are they acting with integrity? Are they using that compensation claims of neutrality to mask the fact that their emissions are still growing when we're trying to reduce them? So I wanted to start off and just say it's very important to understand the difference between ambition, which is the strong desire to do or achieve something important. I'm just reading off that blue box on the right-hand side. Quality, which is when a thing or a process has a high level of value or excellence. And then integrity, which is the attribute of being honest and having strong moral principles. And if we relate that to the climate challenge issue, call it what you will, then we can see that ambition has been defined by the IPCC's, I shouldn't just say their recent report, but their last 3 reports have been very clear about what we need to do. And the Paris Agreement has certainly translated that into something that's quite easy to get our heads around, net zero emissions by 2050. The UNFCCC itself has already recognized that, countries on their own are not going to be able to do this without non-state actors playing a role. So they've got the race to zero, and we've got climate neutral now, to UNFCCC initiatives that seek to complement the Paris Agreement. And then, of course, the Oxford Principles. We all know that they came out and sort of talked about the importance of being ambitious about moving from avoiding and reducing emissions to actually being able to remove them from the atmosphere, because like it or not, we're probably going to need to do that in some way, shape, or form. And then if we go on to the quality element on this diagram, the bottom left-hand bubble, there's a lot of great initiatives that are building adequate quality in the market. WRI, the World Resources Institute, and ISO, the carbon standards have done a great deal to establish how we measure carbon footprints of corporates up and down their supply chains. ISO is working on a carbon neutrality standard, and the carbon standards, and everybody knows who they are, but Vera, Gold Standard, ACR, CAR being the leading ones, have done a great job in developing many, many methodologies that are very technically precise in how they go about measuring mitigation. And of course, more recently, we've had the Carney Task Force on Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market, and their commitment to develop core carbon principles in support of that commoditized market that establish minimum quality criteria for any instruments that get traded in that market. And then we are supporters of ICROA, the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, which has established a code of best practice for organizations providing services into what is called the voluntary carbon market. And then finally, the one that I think is most elusive, integrity, the integrity of actions. This is being honest and having strong moral principles. The Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative has been set up recently, actually to complement the Carney Task Force, the TSVCM, by tackling the really tough issues that have been left out. And more on that in a moment. The Science-Based Targets Initiative have done a tremendous job in establishing the basis by which corporates, non-state actors really need to abate their emissions internally. And they have recently, and in fact, later next week, where are we? No, later this week, will be announcing or launching their net zero standards. So not just science-based targets, but getting to zero, which of course is the ambition set out in the Paris Agreement. So all three of these are definitely moving targets. There's no doubt about it. They're raising their game all along the way. But I believe that over the last 5-6 years or so, there have been a lot of critical review and commentary about the voluntary carbon market and whether it has enough ambition, quality, and integrity to really play a valuable complementary role. And I really believe we've got to the point where those elements are definitely in place.
Jonathan, let me ask you a question there, and you might be coming on to this, or it might be a bit of a tangent, but well, not a tangent, but how much do you think these initiatives and these things, which are very much about the voluntary carbon market or very relevant to private sector action, many of these, how much do you think governments and states are also aware of these and that they might factor into the sort of government negotiations that will go on at COP? How much do you think that sort of comes together?
Well, I think that many nations have understood the value that private sector direct investment in their mitigation activities could, that they could sort of rely on that. There is a worry amongst nations that serving the compliance markets or the compliance requirements under Paris might conflict with the voluntary carbon market, but I don't think that is an issue. So I think it's on people's minds, and I think particularly as we know that we'll be relying on non-state actors to complement or sort of fill in some of the gaps, I think it's going to be an issue that will be explicitly and implicitly spoken about at COP. But let me get on to the next slide, because I think some of that will, in fact, the next two slides will probably answer your question, Rebecca, and hold me to account if not. So first of all, though, let's just talk a little bit about what are the markers of success for COP26? What should we be looking out for? What are the headline issues? And again, I'm going to keep this kind of simple at a high level. Could I have the first bullet, please? So, I've already raised this. Will the nationally determined contributions in aggregate deliver the 1.5 outcome? We're not there yet. And it's not just whether the NDCs will add up, but will they speed up? Having targets that reach out to 2050 with some uncertainty as to whether we'll really make progress along the way won't be helpful. We really need these NDCs to add up and to have very clear plans on how we'll deliver reductions along the way. If we go to the next point, can progress be accurately measured and reported? At the moment, if we're talking about quality, which I mentioned a moment ago, the quality of the transparency frameworks that support the Paris Agreement still need a lot of work. Many of these NDCs are defined in ways that don't make them comparable and certainly don't make them give, they are not yet accounting and reporting protocols that really help us figure out whether each individual NDC is making progress in a meaningful way and where we can compare those efforts and actually aggregate them in a meaningful way. Now, some organizations like ICAP and UNEP have sort of done their best to sort of parse out from these very disparate NDCs what's actually happening, but we really need to put them on a common baseline. And if we go to the next point, this is really the tough one right now, particularly when we've got our global economy and nation states sort of struggling with all of the extra expenditures and costs associated with COVID. Will Article 6 negotiations establish a robust mechanism to increase finance for mitigation? So will there be a more effective successor to the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism, which of course, was designed to help developed economies fund mitigation and adaptation, in fact, in developing economies? We, at the moment, are really uncertain as to whether the CDM will continue or whether it'll be replaced. But from my perspective, we absolutely need to make sure that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which defines this flexible market-based mechanism, and actually it talks about non-market market mechanisms for collaboration and funding, whether they're going to be established. And that is a big part of actually what has supported the voluntary carbon market, voluntary action. Many of the standards that support or create instruments used in the voluntary market really reference the additionality requirements of the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism. So we're going to need something to replace that. And the next point, please. And then will developed nations come good on their climate finance commitments? I guess everybody's bored of hearing the fact that many years ago, the developed nations, in answer to the equity issue, the fact that developed nations have created the problem, developing nations have to be part of the solution and deal with the fallout of climate change. How can they possibly fund that without some support? And there's been a lot of talk about the $100 billion a year by 2020 that developed nations would make available to developing countries. So the question really is that forthcoming? I think the last time I saw everybody total this up, we're up to 74 billion. We'll probably make 100 billion by the time we get to Glasgow. But the real question is it sufficient? If you think about the hundreds of billions of dollars we've used just to prop ourselves up, our economies up during the COVID pandemic, 100 billion split among, let's say, 100 developing economies, that's $1 billion each per year. You can see how paltry this must seem to many, given the size and the shape of the climate challenge. And then to the next point, which is the last. A lot of what I've said is talked about more accuracy and precision in the Paris Agreement to give it quality. But one of the things that we really got to realize is that the transformation that we are talking about to get to a low carbon global economy we're transforming systems, not individual nations, not even individual sectors. And so we need to replace the incrementalism that has bound us till now with mechanisms and requirements on countries and approaches to this that release some of the innovation that the private sector has brought to the market. The speed with which renewable energy has reached parity with fossil fuels is astounding. We often hear people worrying about the fact that the Oxford principles talking about removals and engineered removals that permanently remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, that they're hugely expensive. There's talk, and we can see if we look at some of the early movers paying $600 to $800 a ton from a high quality removal project. But just think about the cost curves and the power curves that we've seen in renewable energy, and imagine releasing that kind of innovation and transformation on the global system. We need to make sure that the rules that we're putting in place encourage that and don't stifle that. So, Rebecca, I'm going to go to the next slide now. And
can I just ask you, I've had a question that I think is relevant to both your point 2 here, but also to the idea about the fact that the private sector is going to become so important in terms of complementing what the NDCs do and the Paris Agreement. And the question is, and I know this is an old nut and that can end in a very long answer, so hopefully you can answer in a relative without getting deep into the complexities, but it's basically, what are the best ways to address double counting, and what are the ways forward for sort of state and non-state actors to address that concern about double counting? Obviously aware also of the difference between double counting and double claiming, but is there something you can say quickly to respond to that question? Because I think it is quite relevant to what you've said up till now.
There is a lot of debate as to whether if a country hosts a mitigation project that delivers a carbon credit, and that credit gets used by a corporation somewhere, but doesn't report that mitigation to the UNFCCC, then the host country kind of owns it by default. And that should do the trick around double counting. But there is a debate which says, and that's why I wanted to start off this whole presentation around ambition, quality, and integrity. Because, really, if we had high quality NDCs that were economy wide, that were supported with regulation and policy, it would be impossible for us to use the carbon standards to find additional additional projects, because regulation and policy would be doing all the heavy lifting. So while we're waiting for NDCs to be fully defined and economy-wide and sorted out, there isn't really as much of a double counting issue. There is double claiming, there's no doubt. The host country double claims and the corporate may claim, and in fact, others may choose to claim some contribution. But in terms of the accounting, I think there's an issue there that is more about integrity. There's a real concern that if we don't show the intention, and I heard Gold Standard use this term the other day, we should have the intentionality of wanting to operate in a in an environment where the Paris Agreement is pretty well implemented. So let's not stop people by saying, oh, well, this isn't a problem because we've got poorly defined NDCs. We should be encouraging countries to do the right thing and make their NDCs economy-wide as soon as we can. But until then, there'll be a transition. And I think the way to deal with that is with transparency. Do these carbon credits come with a corresponding adjustment, i.e. has the host country adjusted its NDC to reflect the fact that somebody else is using a mitigation output? Well, as soon as we get to the point where we can see which countries are providing that function, we can, in the marketplace, or certainly offer clients the options of having a correspondingly adjusted credit or not, then we can really let the demand side, empower more and more countries to do this. I'll stop there. You asked me to keep it simple. It's a tough one.
Well, I think I'm just going to summarize that by saying that when it comes to transfers between countries, ITMOs, corresponding adjustments will be required because that is a counting issue. When it comes to voluntary private sector action and NDCs, double counting is not an issue at the moment because the NDC, the country will count that reduction and the company does not count up to the UN. So it's not a double counting issue.
Correct.
Claiming a whole different, slightly more complicated question.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Let's move to the next slide then, if we can. Now, my hypothesis that I made at the beginning of this is that many of the issues in voluntary and non-state action, concerns around quality and integrity, have been addressed in the last 2 years when we've all been sort of locked down in our home offices, etc. There's been enormous work done. And what I've done is just picked 4 that I think are pretty material. Science-based targets, launching their net zero standard, very, very strong attention to abatement, internal abatement, not much recognition along the way to the use of carbon credits to claim neutrality, and their position, their point of view is that every company, every entity has to reduce along the way. So let's get everybody focused on that as much as we can. So it's the science-aligned abatement. But they do recognize compensation and neutralization. Compensation is what we probably call neutrality or claims of neutrality along the way. And neutralization being the use of removals instruments when you get to your net zero target to get yourself down to net zero, but only when you've reduced 80 to 90% of your emissions would that be acceptable. So the fact that there's now growing recognition, growing uptake on science-based targets, and that the net zero guidance will certainly show us a North Star on what that might look like in a science-aligned world. That's really important developments. The next one on this list is the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets. I mentioned that a little before. And the fact that they're developing a commoditized carbon market, which is great for scaling finance that flows to mitigation projects around the world. But what they're also doing is establishing core carbon principles, recognizing that quality is going to be the hallmark of the success for that initiative. And at the moment, they've gone through 2 phases of concept testing, concept design, and now setting up a governance structure. And so I would expect that commoditized option of using the commoditized market for voluntary action will be in place sometime in the first, second quarter of next year. But 2 of the tough issues that the task force hasn't taken on is the one that you mentioned a moment ago, Rebecca, corresponding adjustments and how you account for voluntary action under the guise or under the umbrella of the Paris Agreement. That's a tough issue. It's also, there is a concern that nation states that host these projects need to have more control over where these mitigation projects or how these mitigation projects map onto their national priorities. And so the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, is really going to pay attention to these issues. They're going to engage countries and say, there is private sector voluntary action that could fund your mitigation priorities, but we need you in your NDCs or in your, in your communications to signal where you want that finance, where you can't deal with this with regulation and policy on a national level, and where you might need help from the commoditized market, or for that matter, the traditional voluntary carbon market. So, and then the third issue that they're taking on, which is the issue of claims. Can you claim carbon neutrality if you're not abating your emissions internally? Who's the arbiter of integrity on corporate action? And the VCMI is sort of pulling itself together, developing a governance structure and a secretariat, and saying, look, we think that civil society groups, environmental NGOs working in concert and in partnership with countries and with market players are well placed to define rules and principles initially, and then potentially rules that will take care of these integrity issues. And then the final one on this slide is one that I just wanted to highlight as an example of the kind of innovation that we are seeing that has come largely out of voluntary action, the voluntary carbon market. The LEAF Coalition, led by Emergent, is a mission-led public-private sector partnership that has set up a fund, I think aiming for $1 billion, that will directly focus on tropical forest protection, restoration, enhancement. What's interesting about it is built on voluntary experience, but it's compliance ready. It's aimed at helping countries help each other, but has also crowded in a number of corporates into its first phases as well. So this can be used for voluntary action as much as compliance. And one of the things that they did is they developed a standard using Winrock, which actually owns ACR, the American Carbon Registry, a bespoke standard that really addresses the special needs that you'll have when you're dealing with nature-based solutions. So those were just 4 examples that I wanted to pull out and say, this is why I believe that voluntary action amongst non-state actors is really ready, willing, and able to play a critical complementary role to whatever happens in Glasgow. I don't know whether you wanted to pick up anything before I moved on to the next slide, Rebecca, on that one.
No, go for it. Thank you.
Okay, good. So I think, though, that one of the things we've got to recognize, those of us who've participated largely in voluntary action, promoting it, supporting it, championing it, is that climate leadership is being redefined by much of what's going on. So a couple of years back, climate leadership would have been targeting net zero, combining, by 2030, having an internal abatement, a target, maybe that was science informed, maybe not, and going carbon neutral all along the way, so that a long-term commitment would be supported by action along the way, not waiting for the target date. But now that the Paris Agreement's target of net zero global economy by 2050 has been adopted by, I think it's about 100 countries have already said, yep, we're going for carbon, we're going for net zero. We're going to align our NDC with that. You could argue that if countries are doing that within their NDCs, policy and regulation will follow. So, but it's going to take time for every country to put net zero plans in place that really deliver. So corporates responding to the net zero call to action in advance of policy and regulation are being responsible. They're taking a climate responsible position, are not waiting for regulation and policy, but really acting in a way that they know is necessary for every actor if we're going to reach that target. So leadership really goes beyond. Now, what I've got up here, I'm sure most people on this webinar will be very familiar with this. On the left-hand side is the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative diagram, which shows how they are really campaigning for, science-based trajectories that respect the science. That's the dotted green line on the top of above the x-axis of that diagram, leading us to a 1.5 aligned mitigation pathway over a shortish period of time. The gray zone beneath that talks about the possibility of compensating, what we would call neutrality along the way, but also the purple columns there showing that by the time you get to your science-based target, if you want to be net zero, your unabated emissions need to be neutralized with removals. So that, in a sense, is what a climate responsible program might look like. On the right-hand side is another diagram, I'm sure many people are familiar with. It's WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Natures, and BCG, Boston Consulting Group, published something in December 2020, Beyond Science-Based Targets, a blueprint for corporate action on climate and nature. And what you can see here is, of course, some sort of hierarchy. You've got to measure, you've got to reduce, you've got to quantify, and that's steps 1 and 2. And then where they go beyond what I think climate responsible is they talk about quantifying a financial commitment by pricing the remaining emissions. And there's talk about using the social cost of carbon, which most people assume is about $100 a ton, to figure out what your financial contribution should be to furthering your efforts beyond internal abatement. And then they talk about the things that you can do, further reduce emissions, unlocking climate solutions, in other words, funding innovations, and then, of course, the purchase and retirement of quality instruments, which could come from a range of activities. And, there are corporates now that are saying leadership means actually removing all of your emissions to the atmosphere on a legacy basis, as Microsoft famously announced, well over a year ago now, or going to climate positive. In other words, making sure that all of your investments, even when you multiply it by the social cost of carbon, sort of really reach beyond net zero. So from my perspective, then climate responsible is being replaced by new definitions of climate leadership, but we do have market initiatives well able to support that. And I'm ready to go on to the next and final slide, Rebecca, unless there's something you want me to elucidate further on. So this is my sort of summary slide, actually. And, what I'm going to say is we've really got to focus on the fundamentals when we're trying to figure out whether COP26 will deliver with the complement of voluntary action. First point, please. So I think I hope I've made the case that COP26, whether it overtly does it or implicitly does it, is going to co-opt voluntary action to close the ambition gaps that we see around finance, urgency, and emissions reductions. In the next point, climate responsible now is all about net zero. Climate leadership goes further and faster, and I would argue, combines commitments with immediate action, whether you call that carbon neutrality, climate neutrality, whatever it is, and that talks about funding or making contributions to mitigation and adaptation beyond abatement activities. The next point is about aligning targets of climate science and adopting an action hierarchy will become the norm. I would say that most organizations over the last 5 to 10 years, many have been able to call themselves climate leaders without having internal abatement, without publishing their carbon footprints, without aligning with the science. And I think those days are behind us. Now we need to see evidence of the hierarchy of actions and an alignment with the science. Next point. And those integrity of claims that are going to be made, which I think is very important for non-state actors to be able to make credible claims with integrity, but they will require deeper transparency and a clear focus on abatement. And when I say deeper transparency, I think that over the next 2 or 3 years, there will be a proliferation of claims. And it's going to be very important for key audiences, consumers or others, to be able to interrogate what these claims might mean, whether it's carbon neutrality, net zero, climate positive. We should encourage those, and we should encourage corporates to be able to differentiate and signal their leadership or responsibility. But there are key stakeholder groups that are going to need to understand what they mean. Next point, please. So I also think that the commodity market that's envisaged by the Carney Task Force will provide the foundation for a global compliance market. And that's going to be critical for the big emitters, oil and gas, minerals, metals, extractives, manufacturing corporates, to really find cost-efficient ways of complementing their abatement in order to meet net zero. But next point, the voluntary carbon market as we've known it will still play a very critical role. If I could just have the next point. To serve corporates that seek diverse impacts. One of the things that we've learned to appreciate, particularly over the last 5 years, and particularly with the struggles that the Convention on Biological Diversity is having to sort of set up similar frameworks in the area of nature, as we're trying to do here for climate, is that mitigation projects that deliver benefits to biodiversity, to local communities, are critical. And those kinds of co-benefits are not always best delivered by a commoditized market. And so the established voluntary carbon market, I think, still has a critical role to play as we go forward. Next point. And, I've talked about climate responsible and climate leadership. And I want to make this my last point, that good leadership will be judged not on its ability to be out front, but to crowd in the good followers and to support good followership, because this is not a race to zero. The first to zero isn't going to save the day. It's when the last corporate gets over zero, when we will have turned climate risk into a mass of opportunity for a better society and a better economy. So my final point again, and it just signals my headline: solid foundations built on the fundamentals, real reductions delivered at scale and with integrity, really are what we're looking for, evidence of our ability to do that after COP26. And Rebecca, that's my last point. And I don't know if we've got time for a few, or if there are any questions you'd like me to address.
Yes, although I think the question I wanted to ask might take a while. So well, first of all, I just want to pick up on your points 4 and 7, really, which is that agreement that while that integrity of claims and that transparency is so critical and is absolutely essential, but also in order to spur on that good followership, we need to encourage more action, and we need the private sector to not feel fearful of taking action because they're worried that they're going to get sort of slammed for not doing something that is perfect, when what they're doing is with good and positive intention. So I think that's quite an important thing. We seem to still have a bit of a dichotomy of a tendency to look immediately at the fault in private sector action rather than looking at the sort of positives to try and spur more followership of it. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, well, I think you've done a great job in sort of saying exactly what I would have felt, that it's really critical that organizations like BCMI and SBTI create a North Star, that we're aiming at, but we need to give people on-ramps, corporates on-ramps to do the right thing. And it speaks to my point about transparency. We should be open to critical review of what we're doing and allow people to see what it is we're doing and suggest ways of improving so that we can continuously improve and continue the good work we've done over the last 10, 15 years.
And Jonathan, we've only got 2 minutes. So the question I wanted to ask was really about the point that you made about biodiversity. I'm not sure if you've got long enough to really answer it, but obviously we realize that biodiversity and climate have got to go hand in hand. But the fact is that at the moment, they're two separate conventions. Is there anything quickly that you'd say that the Convention on Biological Diversity, which we heard was in the news quite a lot in the last couple of weeks, should learn from the COP process and the sort of NDCs?
Well, it's kind of interesting because I will try and keep this short. If we knew then what we know now when we were setting up the UNFCCC, we probably would have turned to industry sectors and chosen the top 10 emitters and said, we need sector plans to solve, to abate and mitigate emissions from those sectors, as we're doing with the aviation sector, because climate is a global problem. Of course, biodiversity is very, very contextual. This is, in fact, where we need nationally determined plans to protect biodiversity. So all the lessons we've learned about working with nations to develop plans that can be funded should be used by the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, because it is, in fact, nations that have to solve that problem. But it's certainly carbon finance got a critical role to play in supporting that.
Brilliant, thank you. I had several more questions and there were a few more came in, but we have run up against time. So I want to thank you, Jonathan, very much. Fantastic as always. And thank everyone who attended. We had a huge number of attendees, so we really appreciate that. And just to remind you that on the 23rd of November, we will be running a follow-up webinar to see what happened at COP and what are the impacts of what happened. So please do register for that when the link comes out. We will be sending you the link to this webinar that's been recorded, and really thank everyone very much, and fingers crossed for a successful COP in a couple of weeks.
I'm going to add my thanks and farewells. I hope to see some of you in Glasgow.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.